Good afternoon. I'm Mike Beam, and I have the privilege and the honor to serve as your Secretary of Agriculture at the Kansas Department of Agriculture. With me today is Kelsey Olson, the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture. We want to welcome you to the 5th Annual Agricultural Growth Summit.
The Kansas Department of Agriculture has traditionally hosted our Agricultural Growth Summit at the end of August. But this year, in the interest of public health, we opted to do to switch to a virtual session. This is our 20th webinar and that we've hosted as part of the Ag Growth Summit. And it began with 17 different industry sector breakouts that we hosted and focused on the opportunities for growth in the Kansas agriculture. We featured many outstanding Kansans who were able to share their stories and experiences. I want to thank each and every one of you who have helped to make our sessions great success this year, and those that have served as our panelists, moderators, or guests. This week, we've had the opportunity to discuss some statewide efforts that are focused to support the growth of the initiatives that are going on, and how the Kansas agriculture industry has adapted throughout the past few months and in response to COVID-19.
Today, we will turn our attention to global marketing dynamics and opportunities in the grain, ethanol, and red meat markets. As this slide will show you, exports are very important to the Kansas economy. As you'll see, in 2019, our state exported over $3.8 billion in ag commodities to 97 countries. Top export products include meat and edible offals, cereals, oilseeds, residues, and waste and dairy products. The next slide shows you that in 2019, our top 5 trade partners were Mexico, Japan, Canada, South Korea, and Taiwan. These 5 countries account for nearly 75% of our agricultural exports. This afternoon, we're fortunate to have some key national leaders who will share their expertise in this critical and vital field of importance in the area of international trade.
Before we begin, we'll just go over a little bit. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature that is at the bottom of your screen. You can submit those questions and we'll try to get those answered as they come in. And then also then as we're moderating the discussion with our speakers and our moderator at the end of the session. If you do want to ask a question, we encourage you to include your name and your organization if appropriate, so that we can address that and include that as those questions come through. First on our agenda today is Cary Sifferath. Cary serves as the Senior Director of Global Programs for the U.S. Grains Council, a nonprofit organization that promotes the global use of U.S. barley, corn, sorghum, and related products, including ethanol and distillers' dried grains with solubles. He oversees the Council's 10 international offices and all worldwide programs. Cary has held various positions within the Council over the past 27 years, including Regional Director for the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, the China Director, Japan Director, and the Southeast Asia Regional Director. Cary, we welcome you to our conversation.
Well, thank you, Kelsey. Appreciate the introduction, and good afternoon. I know it's afternoon here in DC. It should be afternoon by now, and back in Kansas as well. I don't know if my presentation is up yet or not. There we go. And so, as Kelsey said, I am the Senior Director of Global Programs for the U.S. Grain Council. Go to the next slide. Just a quick overview, just in case not everybody's familiar with the U.S. Grain Council is. We are a private nonprofit organization that develops export markets for U.S. corn, barley, and sorghum, as was mentioned, as well as various co-products, which today include DDGS and ethanol. And ethanol has become a major part of our global programming footprint. We are supported by our membership which are made up of various state and national checkoffs. The one national checkoff we have is the United Sorghum Checkoff program, which is even represented here today by Florentino Lopez. We have various state associations, Department of Agriculture and Farm Bureaus that are members of the Grain Council, and over 115 different ag businesses that are members of ours that represent companies that are involved in production, transportation, exporting of grains, and even now lately, quite a few of the ethanol industry, both associations and individual plants and companies are members of the Grain Council. Our membership does include Kansas Corn Commission, the Kansas Grain Sorghum Commission, the Kansas Department of Agriculture, our host here today, and the Kansas Farm Bureau. So Kansas is well represented within the U.S. Grain Council membership. Next slide, please. This here shows our global footprint. Our headquarter office here in Washington, D.C. Those kind of goldish teardrops represent where we have offices or regional offices around the world. The smaller dots are where we have staff or representatives that work for us in those countries or regions as well. I won't go over all of it, but just to point out, and I'm going to shift into what COVID-19 has done for us, or done to both programming and market-wise. But somewhere around between March 15th and 18th, all of these offices were shut down. We pretty much shut down all our global offices worldwide, had everybody working from home back in mid-March. We have, since then, we've started to open up or partially open up a few of our offices, predominantly in Asia and some of the markets where things have improved as far as the COVID-19 issues go. Other places, we are still completely working from home. But these are the operations that represent the Grain Council and our members as we work to promote exports of feed grains in all forms globally. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit on COVID-19 and how that's affected U.S. Grain Council programs and even what's happened marketing-wise with corn, barley, sorghum, DDGS, ethanol, and such. When it first hit and we started to, after we shut down all of our offices worldwide, our first thing we did was to assure our international customers that the U.S. grain marketing system is open for business. We were able to work with a couple of our agribusiness members and shot some videos showing that port operations down in New Orleans were loading vessels, operations on the river and other upstream transportation, grain transportation is involved in moving grain and co-products to the export market, including even loading of DDGS and other grain products in containers, was all up and running and was going to continue to work. We then even had Ryan LeGrand, who's the CEO of U.S. Grain Council, wrote letters to all the major corn, sorghum, barley, ethanol importers in the various markets worldwide that we work with. This letter example here is a letter in Japanese to one of the big Japanese grain importers, assuring them that U.S. grain business was open. Our farmers were still ready to move product to export terminals as needed, and that the Department of Homeland Security was declaring grain exports as an essential part of the U.S. economy. And so we expected and look to see for all that to remain open to assure our international customers that they could come and buy U.S. grain products and be assured that they would be delivered during this global pandemic. And with that, we've seen very little interruptions on movement of grain and co-products and ethanol into the export market. As far as demand globally, on the grain side, a few markets have been down. Other markets have actually been up. And so overall, I don't know that we've seen a lot of decrease due to COVID-19, probably more, especially earlier in this crop year and competition-wise from our competitors, predominantly in South America. On the ethanol side, just like in the U.S., when people locked down and started working from home and that transportation demand for gasoline was decreased, we did see a decrease for ethanol exports into some of the markets that we export for fuel blending. Although here recently we've seen an uptick in ethanol exports for hand sanitizers or other sanitizing uses, and I'll talk about a little bit about that in the coming slides here. Next slide, please. After that initial, we're here, we're open for business, please feel comfortable to come and buy U.S. grain co-products. Our second step was then to adjust our global programming and our trade servicing or customer servicing outreach, because we continued to have customers around the globe wanting to know what's going on, wanting to know what's the latest thing, and having even technical questions of how to use grains in different ways. And so just like here, this virtual meeting, it's become the norm. Virtual meetings, conferences, webinars have become the normal. We've everything from one-on-one programs with specific companies to address their specific issues, to bigger webinars where you're talking to multiple companies in a market or a region, to even large conferences where we've had 600-700 people listening to a conference in 4 different languages simultaneously. And it happened to be 10 to midnight my time because it was going on in Asia. Our Southeast Asia office, which does their August buyers conference every August jointly with U.S. Soybean Export Council, they just had that about a week and a half ago, with over 450 participants taking part in a over 3-day virtual buyers conference. And so we've adjusted and made those commitments. I always worry about whether you're putting too much webinars out there. At the same time, we continue to see strong interest and participation in the programs we do put together. In some cases, we have had some limited face-to-face meetings in specific markets. This picture here in the center, Soo Kim is our Korea director there in the blue U.S. Grain Council hat and a mask. There he's actually doing some one-on-one. He's actually on top of a Panamax vessel in Incheon Port in Korea, addressing some questions from the importer of that corn vessel. Next slide, please. Now, past COVID-19, to talk a little bit on some of the 3 areas of trade highlights. I'm going to talk about India and South Asia, USMCA and Mexico, and then touch on China and phase 1. So next slide. India and the South Asia region. This is, while we've been doing things in India for 20 years or more, we've made a big commitment here, even probably going back about 2 years now, into setting up an office and a regional operation in South Asia. And when I talk South Asia, I'm talking India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, population of about 1.7 billion people. We do have a regional director, Alejandra Danielson Castillo is our South Asia regional director. She actually is currently stationed in Singapore as we're continuing to work on getting our actual registration to open up an office in New Delhi. We do have some long-term staff that have worked for us a long time already in India, but hopefully quite soon we'll be having a full-fledged office in New Delhi. An important note here is the Kansas Corn Commission has given us specific specialized grants that allowed us to go out and make that leap and look to not only put a staff person out there, but look to open up an office. So a big thanks to the Kansas Corn Commission for that extra grant that they've given us to allow us to do that. Next slide. Many of you may think, that part of the world, we don't see a lot of corn or sorghum or DDGS traded, but you're actually seeing quite a bit of whether it's corn or sorghum in the form of ethanol being exported to India. I don't know how many people realize, but India is our #3 export market for U.S. ethanol. It has been for about the last 4 years now. We see down versus a year ago, it's down a little bit, but overall, India continues to be a strong market for U.S. ethanol exports. The key point here is that right now, today, imported ethanol cannot be used for blended into fuel use in India. Only domestically produced ethanol can. India has an E10 mandate, but they don't produce enough ethanol to meet that, and so their blend rate is definitely below the 10%, probably more around 5.5%. And so all that imported ethanol is coming in to make up for the industrial ethanol demand that India has, that since all their domestic ethanol is going for the fuel use. And so we are seeing grain exports to India in the form of ethanol happening today. Next slide. There's also a U.S.-India trade agreement under discussion. President Trump's visit to India back last February kind of set some goodwill and initial trade agreement, and hopefully a lot of pushes to have a trade agreement done by election time. With COVID-19 outbreak, some of the bilateral cooperation on medical supplies back and forth has also helped with kind of the goodwill between the two countries. Some trade irritants, equalization duties predominantly on digital services have been kind of set aside so we can talk on other parts within the trade negotiation. And those negotiations, while travel is definitely not happening, the exchanging of texts going back and forth between the two countries is taking place. The Green Council has worked very closely with USTR to make sure that DDGS, which is not allowed to be imported into India today, as well as ethanol to be used, imported ethanol to be used in the fuel blending to be part of that trade deal. We remain positive. Things seem to be moving along in a positive way, but since they're trying to get this done by election, that window is closing every day. So we hope we see something happen here soon on the India trade agreement. Next slide, please. Next, I'll talk a little bit about USMCA and Mexico. Why does the Grain Council care about Mexico? Obviously, it was the top market, I think, for Kansas on the data just shown. Mexico is our #1 corn export market, our #1 DDGS export market. If you're in barley country, it's the #1 barley and barley malt export country market for us. It's the second largest sorghum export market for us, and seeing growing potential for ethanol exports, which I'll touch on here in a second. Next slide, please. USMCA, which obviously includes Canada, and Canada also an important market. It's our second largest ethanol export market and a good steady export market for US corn and DDGS. But USMCA agreement, as we know, went into effect back in July. Is kind of a template for future trade agreements. At least that's how the Grain Council looks at it. But since it's been signed, and even probably leading up to it being signed, there was already some trade policy disagreements kind of brewing within Mexico and the U.S. That will probably be some early tests on the USMCA agreement. We've seen, ban on glyphosate, both imports of the product and now use, and whether that may lead to even MRL on imported grain products into Mexico. We've seen Mexico now starting to delay approvals of biotech or GM event for corn. We've seen some seasonal produce issues. That's more on the U.S. side, where some of the fruit and vegetable producers are wanting to put seasonal tariffs on Mexico fruit and vegetables coming in, which is never a good precedent. That leaves the door open to, does Mexico put seasonal tariffs on corn going into Mexico during their harvest season? So definitely things that we watch very closely. And even here recently, U.S. has put aluminum tariffs on Canada. So even Canada is part of the kind of growing issue between testing of the USMCA agreement. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, Mexico is a growing and what we see a potential market for U.S. ethanol. In April, we saw a large increase of Mexico's imports of ethanol from an average of about 3 million gallons to 15 million gallons in April. We've seen that continue in that 15 million gallon range for May and June, although June, some of that included Brazilian ethanol coming into Mexico. So competition is always around the corner. We're seeing a blend of old and new players that are importing ethanol. Some of that is coming in via rail cars to be blended in for fuel use. And now a big surge of that import use is for sanitizers, hand sanitizers, and other sanitizing uses. And so we're encouraging Mexico importers to make sure they meet with the U.S. exporters and producers, especially those that are producing specifically sanitizing ethanol, and have promoted the support for corn ethanol hand sanitizers. Next slide. But just like in the U.S., Mexico has put up some barriers. The petroleum industry and the MTBE industry, similar to what we saw in the U.S. here years ago, is not really welcoming and opening to fuel blending of ethanol. So back in 2017, the U.S. Grain Council, with many other people involved, were able to get a the Mexico Supreme Court to rule and allow a 10% blend for fuel ethanol or for fuel use in Mexico, all except for the three largest cities, Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. Here recently, there's been some pushback. The Cary, which is Mexico's Energy Regulatory Commission, had some legal action taken up that they did not follow all the procedures. And so that's been taken back to the Supreme Court and wanting to move from 10% back to a 5.8% blend maximum. There was 180 work days grace period for E10 put on that was back in February. With COVID-19, the Supreme Court has not been able to meet, and so that keeps getting pushed forward, although they have now set that as a final date of March 26, 2021. But discussions continue. The Grain Council, along with other players, both on the U.S. and Mexico side, are meeting on a regular basis. Actually, a weekly call is happening to do what we can to fight against this allowing ethanol to slip from a 10% blend back to a 5.8% blend in fuel use in Mexico. We've worked on doing different studies that show the cost benefit to Mexico, savings on being able to blend ethanol rather than MTBE in their gasoline. Lots of interaction with different Mexican government, including President Lopez Obrador, the Ministry of Agriculture, President's Office, Energy Ministry, and others that we've dealt with, and even Pemex, the longtime large state-run oil company in Mexico that for a long time had a monopoly on petroleum business in Mexico. It does not anymore, and they've normally been very anti-ethanol, but we're now starting to see even them open up in certain areas and wanting to work with us even a bit as they're starting to see where they could be making some extra money using ethanol as well. So there is potential. We'll keep pushing on that, so that besides just being a large market for corn, barley, sorghum, and DDGS, we see Mexico being a very good market for U.S. ethanol going forward. Next slide. Last subject I'll talk about is China and phase one. Always in the news, it seems. Even today, I see President Trump has even canceled any ideas of sitting down with the Chinese to continue negotiations on this trade. But phase one is there, and even with everything in the news, it continues to operate. So what has or what hasn't changed? On the China side, the 301 retaliatory tariffs, which was a 25% tariff for the most part on many U.S. agricultural products, those tariffs had not been removed, but importers can apply for an exemption. For what we've seen, importers very easily have been able to apply and receive those exemptions. And so, at least for the products we cover, and I'm sure Joe will talk on pork and beef, probably into China as well, we've seen those exemptions handed out fairly easily. But because of the way the TRQ, the tariff rate quota on corn works in China, and maybe in the Q&A I can really dive into that if somebody wants to, but most of the tariff rate quota, about 60%, is in the hands of state trading enterprises, SOEs, because in most of the private sector, they've already used up their quota, and even the state trading companies have probably gone above their quota, so we know that there's extra quota being given out, whether it's been officially announced or not, where sorghum is more freely traded. And so while we've seen, and I'll show the numbers, big buying of corn by China, which is almost predominantly by the state-run trading companies there, the private sector doesn't have access to that, and so that's why they have been and will continue to buy, I think, sorghum, and we'll see China continue to be a major player for U.S. sorghum exports. On DDGS, the anti-dumping and countervailing duty case that was finalized back in January 2017 is still in place, and those duties are still in place, and there is no exemption for that, so we've seen very little movement on DDGS as part of phase one. With ethanol, while you can, and we know companies have applied for a 301 exemption on U.S. ethanol, there still is a 231 retaliatory tariff of 15%. All the 231 tariffs were not part of phase one, so that 15% tariff is still on U.S. ethanol. and China has an MFN rate, or their bound rate, of 30%. So if I was to import U.S. ethanol into China today, I would pay a 30 or a 45% total import duty. And so that's very prohibitive, and that's why we've seen basically no ethanol trade into China either within phase one. But phase one did allow us to resolve some technical issues. We've seen biotech events approvals being taken care of, and at least a framework to keep that moving going forward. Processing license by feed mills that they need to be able to import and use biotech corn into their feed mills. That whole system has been approved. Registration or re-registration of ethanol plants in the U.S. to be able to export DDGS has been approved. And a protocol for U.S. barley exports has been approved. And so we're seeing some movement even on U.S. barley into China. Next slide, please. Well, next slide, please. So what's happened so far within phase one? If we look at export sales of corn and sorghum through USDA's data, which runs through August 6th, so I'll get updated next week. And this doesn't include some of the trades, the spot trades that were announced yesterday for corn by USDA. But for old crop, or the 2019-20 marketing year, over 2.2 million tons, or over 87 million bushel of corn has been either shipped or sold and ready to ship yet by the end of August. Over 3.8 million tons of sorghum, or over 150 million bushel of sorghum, again, has been sold, shipped and or sold and ready to ship before August. So some big numbers there. Already, if we look at new crop sales, China is by far the leader. Over 5.7 million tons of corn that China has bought, over 225 million bushels. And not quite, but just under 1 million metric tons, or about 38 million bushels of sorghum for new crop sorghum has been purchased by China. And again, as I mentioned, because of those issues, we haven't seen any movement in DDGS or ethanol. On top of all this, if we look at reported sales to unknown destinations, there's 348,000 metric tons of corn and 214,000 metric tons of sorghum of old crops sold to unknown destinations. For corn, it's hard to say that that's all China. I would guess some of it is. For sorghum, Florentino may agree with me or maybe not. I would say predominantly most of that, if not all of that, unknown destination sorghum is probably China buying. If we look at new crop, we have over 1 million metric tons of corn sold to unknown destinations, and about 715,000 metric tons of sorghum sold to unknown destinations. Again, I would say that sorghum is predominantly, if not all, China. The corn, probably parts of it, but not all. And so we have seen some real strong sales of corn and sorghum, both of old crop and new crop, into China through phase one. And I'll talk a little bit why this is happening even outside of what's going on with phase one. So next slide, please. Has the day finally come? I know I've been dealing with grain exports with the Grain Council, and even what's gone on in China for 27 years. A lot of people talking about, when is China going to become this big corn importer that people have talked about for years and years and years. Well, if you actually look at the data and you look at feed grains in total, when I add up corn, sorghum, barley, and DDGS, and I've even seen charts that will throw cassava into this, China has consistently imported 15 million metric tons of total feed grains over the last several years, going back to 2013, although 2018 dropped down to only 10 million metric tons, but that's still quite a large feed grain import market. And so we've seen steady demand for feed grains when we add all these up, and sorghum has been a big part of that. DDGS had been, that's been basically shut off since 2017, but even without DDGS as part of that mix, we're seeing China on a regular basis importing 15 million metric tons of feed grains in total. Next slide. Why is that? Why is China's feed grain demand, and what's happening there? A lot of quite interesting things is happening. I don't know how many people watch, but the last 12 weeks, China's temporary reserves, they've auctioned off 4 million tons a week. So over 48 million metric tons, or over 1.8 billion bushels of corn have been sold. And this is 2014 or 2015 crops sold at some fairly high prices. Hasn't ASF reduced China's hog numbers by 40, 50, 60%, whatever number you've read and want to put in there. But we're starting to see a lot of hog operations, swine operations come back, rebuilding their herds, and they're shifting away from your inferior feeds, reducing or basically eliminating any kind of restaurant waste, which is just a great way of spreading ASF. And so while we have less hogs in China, as they start to build back those herds are eating predominantly corn, sorghum, soybean meal based diets and not all the different inferior feeds that we have seen in the past. And then very strong demand from the broiler and layer, and even the cattle and aquaculture section, as we continue to see demand with the reduction in pork production, and then that even leads into pork and beef imports, which I'm sure you'll hear about here shortly. And even Australia, which has exported a lot of feed barley into China over the last few years. China here recently put an anti-dumping and countervailing duty of about 80.5% on Australian barley, which is also kind of throwing a wrench into where and when they can import feed grains. Next slide. And so why is all this happening? As we look at corn prices in China, and I put this chart together and even put it in dollars per bushel to make more sense to everybody back in Kansas. Everything behind to the left of that yellow line is when China still had their corn price support policy up in Northeast China. And everything to the right is after they removed those support prices. The red line kind of in the middle, that's corn price up in Changchun. It's up in the center of Northeast China, kind of the center of their main corn production area. The green line is what Chinese corn delivered into Shirkou port, the main port down in southern China in Guangzhou area. And the blue line is what it would be delivering U.S. corn into that same Shirkou port. And so as we can see back in July of 2018, when those retaliatory tariffs of 25% were put in, we can see a large jump in U.S. corn price landed into China. When I start to take those 301 tariffs back out here in mid-February, that U.S. corn price drops. At the same time, we've seen corn prices within China continuing to really climb. Right now we're at over $2, maybe even over $2.25 a bushel spread between domestic corn price and what U.S. corn can be landed in there. And so just price-wise, you can see there's a reason to be buying and importing U.S. corn into China today with or without a phase one agreement. Back to that TRQ, the fact that only the state-run companies are able to import corn, and so that private sector is going out and bidding for sorghum and bidding some strong prices, and why you see some strong basis prices for sorghum in central Kansas today. Again, even there's big incentive for the private sector to want to be out there buying sorghum because of that large price spread of what imported corn or imported sorghum is versus the domestic corn price. So next slide, I'll end there. I can take any questions during the Q&A portion, and there's lots of subjects I didn't necessarily hit on in my here that maybe people have questions outside of those areas. So thank you.
Thank you, Cary. Yes, as a reminder, questions, submit those through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And after the next presenter, we'll start into those questions. But at this point, I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Joe Schuele, who is Vice President of Communications for the U.S. Meat Export Federation. He joined there in 2008 after a similar position with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. He is originally from central Nebraska, where he grew up on a diversified farm that produced corn, soybeans, cattle, and hogs. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. I've just got a few slides I'll go through. I know that most of you are pretty familiar with U.S. Meat Export Federation, but I'll give you just a little bit of background. We were founded in 1976, coming up on 45 years of existence. We are the international marketing arm for U.S. beef, pork, and lamb. And we enjoy excellent support from the state of Kansas. go on to the next slide, we have longtime support, not only from the Kansas Department of Agriculture, the Beef Council, the Corn and Soybean Commission, and the Kansas Farm Bureau, but we have many agribusinesses in Kansas that are members of USMEF. In fact, our incoming chair this fall will be a gentleman from Cargill Meat Solutions based in Wichita, and one of our executive committee members is a cattle feeder based in Manhattan. So we certainly appreciate all the great support that we get from the state of Kansas. If you look at our membership sectors, we enjoy great diversified support from many sectors of U.S. agriculture, not only from pork, beef, and lamb producers, but the corn and soybean sectors are also very supportive of USMEF. We greatly appreciate the support of those state and national organizations. Very forward-looking policy on their part to understand that red meat exports fuel expansion, they fuel growth in the U.S. livestock sector, and that's their largest customer. And so we certainly appreciate the support that we receive from corn and soybean producers as well as livestock producers. Next slide, please. A little bit about the roles of USMEF. Obviously, our consumer marketing and our marketing to the trade is a very visible part of what we do. We're out there certainly promoting the positive attributes of U.S. red meat, both at the consumer level and at the importer distributor level. But behind the scenes, we are engaged in a lot of technical support, technical services that keep that product moving. It's not as visible a part of what we do, but it's extremely important. At any point in time, you've got millions of dollars of product out on the water or headed north and south via truck, and the more we can do to keep that product moving smoothly, the better. So that's a very important part of our job. We also work very closely with USTR and USDA on ensuring market access. This can be either in the form of formal trade agreement negotiations, but even more often than that, simply ironing out barriers, obstacles, certain glitches in trade that can hold up a lot of those processes. And probably for every one of those that you might read about, either in the agricultural media or the business media, there's probably 25 or 30 that are good friends at USDA and USTR are ironing out without a lot of fanfare or a victory lap. It's really an everyday part of their job, and we appreciate the great working relationship we have with them to keep that product moving. We also, in normal times, will work a lot with buyer teams, bringing them to the United States to view our production process, both on the farm and ranch level and at the processing level. We also show them how red meat is merchandised here in the United States. We don't have the opportunity to do much of that this year, but that is a very important part of our job. We have found other ways to communicate with those buyers, but those bringing them to the United States is something that we hope to resume as quickly as possible. So that's a little bit of background on the various roles that USMEF plays. Next slide, please. This is just gives you a quick snapshot of where we are located. We have 18 offices in terms of physical presence across the world. As you might guess, our resources are placed most heavily in the markets where we have the most activity. So we have a pretty well-rounded, substantial office presence in places like Tokyo, Seoul, Mexico City, our Hong Kong, China office, where we have not only marketing staff, but people that work on technical issues, people that work closely with the trade, with meat processors. In other markets, like say Taiwan is a good example. We'll have a medium-sized office with a few people. Singapore is another example of that. We generally had a few people operating out of our office in Singapore to cover Southeast Asia. But as they represented the red meat industry in a larger and larger region, with more and more activity stretching really all the way from Australia, New Zealand, all the way over to Thailand, we've added some resources there in places like Manila and Ho Chi Minh City. Our newest office would be a person that we've hired as our first ever representative in Sub-Saharan Africa. He's based in Durban, South Africa. As I'll talk about a little bit later, we see Africa as a very promising region for long-term growth. And so this gives you a little bit of idea of where USMEF's resources are deployed throughout the world. I'll go to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about how red meat exports complement a very robust domestic market. I think it's important to discuss that relationship, especially in light of some recent issues that have hit the news, some narratives that hit the news as we face some short-term product shortages or supply crunch at our domestic retail stores. We emphasize that about 85% of the beef produced in the United States is consumed here. About 70 to 75% of the pork that's produced here in the United States is consumed here. But we consider the export markets to be very complementary of that. Exports are a great way to maximize carcass value by getting cuts and variety meat items to the markets that value them the most. By doing so, exports drive industry expansion. They are a great source of optimism in the industry that prompt producers and processors to expand capacity. And I think that's evidenced by our current levels of production. We've been really sitting at record levels of red meat production for a couple of years now, and exports played a big role in getting us there. Unfortunately, as we reach these unusual times, there was a narrative that hit some of the news media that perhaps exports were taking from domestic consumers, right? They were making that we were prioritizing the export markets over our domestic consumers, and we really want to discuss that as kind of a misguided notion, because as I said, it really ignores the impact that exports have on production. If you look at our pork industry, for example, if we weren't exporting hams and picnics and other products to Mexico, we weren't exporting ground seasoned pork and loins to Japan, if we weren't exporting variety meats to China, if we didn't have those outlets for those items, our pork industry simply would not be the size that it is today. There's just no way that it would be. The same on the beef side, as we export underutilized muscle cuts to several markets, as we ship tongues to Japan and items like tripe and other variety meat to Mexico and other Latin American markets. This is just a very important driver of production and supply. And so we find it a bit short-sighted when some in the media or even in the industry, we get people that feel that exports are somehow competing with the domestic market and making it more difficult for U.S. consumers to get the products they want. We would look at that very differently, because in order, for example, and I'll go to the next slide now that'll kind of illustrate that. As we look at some of the products that are exported, this will show you that we do certainly export some of the middle meats that U.S. consumers really like, but not a high percentage. Underutilized cuts like short plate, for example, exported at a very high percentage. Short ribs to Korea and other markets. We export a lot of gooseneck rounds to markets like Mexico. And if you go on to the variety meat slide, that will show you that some of these products for which there's really no domestic demand at all. We're shipping massive quantities of tongues to Japan. It's a very high value market, adds about $12 per head, our ability to ship tongues to Japan. We look at products like lips and tripe, livers going to Mexico. Egypt is our largest liver market, but we've been diversifying those markets. We're shipping a lot of livers also to places like South Africa and Angola. These are products for which everyone in the supply chain needs to get a return. And when they get a return on these items, that helps drive production. We'll look a little bit on the pork side. You'll see a similar picture there. We do export some pork belly, but not a high percentage because of a very strong domestic appetite for bacon. Some of the rib complex is exported, but most of it stays here. Same with the loins. But as this chart will help emphasize, in order to have all of that bacon and those ribs and those center cut pork chops that U.S. consumers enjoy, you need to ship a lot of products to other markets. And so our ability to ship those underutilized cuts in large quantities to our foreign markets is very helpful in driving production in the U.S. pork sector. I'll go on to the pork variety meat slide. That'll give you a little bit of a picture. Again, really not much domestic demand at all for these products, but this gives you a little bit of a snapshot of how they're utilized in overseas markets and the top destinations for those products. If you want to move on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about, and again, that issue has sort of died down a little bit. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but we do like to talk about how exports fit into the picture as a complement to our domestic market. Looking at 2020, we began with some really significant tailwinds this year in the form of trade agreements and other reasons for optimism. I'll talk a little bit more about these trade agreements as we get to individual markets. We had a really landmark agreement with Japan. Cary mentioned the phase 1 agreement with China. I'll get into that a little bit more. USMCA being ratified by all 3 countries early in the year just took effect in July, but really the big hurdle for red meat trade was the ratification by all 3 countries early in the year, because we already really had really good access to Mexico and Canada, but needed to get that new agreement ratified so that it removed a lot of uncertainty, so that we didn't need to worry about whether NAFTA might go away, whether we might have interruptions in trade. We faced some retaliatory duties from those 2 countries over the past couple of years. And so that ratification of USMCA really helped smooth trade relations and reassure a lot of our buyers in those 2 markets of a smooth business environment going forward. Also had some changes to the EU beef quota that I'll discuss in a little more detail. And we also entered the year with a supply advantage over most of our competitors. Some of them are facing herd rebuilding and some other supply challenges. And so we felt coming into 2020 that we were really in a strong position to set records in both the pork and beef sectors. If you move on to the next slide, that scenario was playing itself out in the first quarter. We really raced out to a great start to this year. Record pace for both beef and pork exports, outstanding growth in most major markets, but that certainly has been slowed by COVID-19, mostly on the production side, where we've had the interruptions in slaughter and production. Started probably around late April and stretched into early June, so we feel like we've got the worst of that behind us. Now, COVID-19 also had an impact on demand in certain areas, the food service sector, hospitality sector, that has especially impacted beef demand in some markets. But as we think, as we put those supply challenges behind us and we see some recovery in the global food service sector, we think we're poised for a very strong second half. But certainly the first half is kind of a tale of 2 quarters, as we saw a real slowdown in the second quarter. So through the first half of the year, beef exports down about 9% in volume, down 10% in value. We hope to gain most of that back in the second half. That'll be difficult, but we really felt like we were headed for a record year in beef exports, probably in the range of the $8.5 billion mark, breaking our 2018 record, but it's going to be tough to get there now. We hope to get most of this slowdown back, but we'll probably fall short of where our projections for this year were pre-COVID. Pork exports also negatively impacted. Now, some people will find that hard to believe because in the first half, we're still up 24% in volume, value up almost 30%. But believe me, they would have been even stronger had we not had these interruptions in supply. Demand has not been impacted quite as much, but in some key markets like Mexico and Colombia, we've seen some challenges on pork demand as well. But I'll get into that a little more as we go to the individual markets. Next slide, please. So our marketing activities, how have those adjusted into this rather volatile new environment? It has certainly heightened the need to reach consumers in different ways. You're not going to have the in-person, face-to-face contact that has been so important to us over the years. Luckily, we certainly already had a head start on reaching them through social media and other online platforms, but that has certainly accelerated. COVID-19 has certainly accelerated the need to do that. Now, in-store promotion of red meat products is also important, and we have seen tasting demonstrations, preparation demonstrations, cooking demonstrations have returned to some of the retail outlets, depending on the market. In some markets, some retailers have resumed those promotions. Some are still reluctant to do so. But even where they've resumed, realistically, consumers are spending less time in the store when they are doing the in-person shopping, as you probably see play out here in our own supermarkets and other retail outlets. People are being more cautious, the social distancing in place. People are spending a bit less time in the store than they had in the past. And so it really puts an emphasis on being on top of mind when they start their shopping. We need to reach out to those consumers, have them have U.S. beef and pork on the top of their shopping list before they ever enter the store. Now, it's also placed a heavy emphasis on assisting both retailers and restaurants with how to serve the pickup and delivery market. How do we help them reach out to this new set of customers? Pickup and delivery might have only been a very small part of their business up until this year. Now it's really growing, and a lot of this is probably going to survive post-COVID. So USMEF has been involved in helping these businesses adjust to a new environment. Also at the trade level, we've been working with a lot of importers and distributors on how do we redirect some of these cuts that would normally have gone to food service. How do we redirect those to retail where demand is really booming? Food service demand obviously much slower. So we've seen a lot of this, just as you've seen in the domestic market, seeing the need to redirect some of these cuts that normally were really heavily focused on in restaurants and cafeterias and other food service outlets. Now they're in the retail stores. How do we merchandise them? How do we educate consumers about them? How do we keep as much of that product moving as possible through what has really been a booming retail sector? Now, as far as our training activities, we used to bring together a lot of chefs and importers, a lot of other industry professionals for training sessions. We've moved a lot of that moved almost all of that now to virtual platforms. Now, there are some advantages to that. We've been able to better target some of those sessions, make them a little bit more specialized. Also found some cost savings in reaching out to larger numbers of people when you don't have travel involved. So certainly we want to get back to those in-person trainings. There's nothing like those hands-on training sessions and face-to-face contact with those industry professionals, but there have been some advantages as we've moved those to virtual platforms. Next slide, please. So now I'll talk a little bit about individual markets, and at the top of that list is Japan, which is traditionally our top value market for U.S. red meat. We were very excited to see the new U.S. Japan agreement go into effect January 1. That was absolutely critical from the standpoint of keeping pace with our major competitors, both in the beef and pork sector. Most people are familiar with the fact that we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The 11 remaining countries went forward with that. That meant a lot of better access, especially on the beef side for Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Mexico, and on the pork side primarily for Canada and Mexico into Japan. Not as talked about as much is at about that same time, the European Union reached an economic partnership agreement with Japan. And while the EU is not a member of the TPP-11, for the purposes of red meat trade with Japan, they essentially got the same terms of access. So that really meant that all of our major competitors in Japan had better access, had relief from the very high tariffs in Japan. And so it was very important that we get on a level playing field with them. That the new agreement has accomplished that. We were facing beef tariffs on most cuts of 38.5%. That's already down to below 26%, and will ratchet down to 9% by 2033. Now that's a long time to get to 9%, but the sooner we can get started, the better. So we very much look forward to having beef enter Japan at more reasonable tariff rates. The pork tariffs are a bit more complicated. They vary a lot by product, but suffice it to say that getting on a level playing field with Europe and Canada and even Mexico has helped us a lot. We took a big hit on products like ground seasoned pork. We've regained our market share there now that we have a level playing field on tariffs. And we've also been able to grow demand for high value chilled pork. Our primary competitor there is Canada. Canada is still doing well in Japan, but we've been able to get an uptick in business now that we're facing more reasonable tariffs. So without the COVID related roadblocks in both supply and on the demand side, we felt like we were headed maybe even for a $4 billion year in Japan, probably something along the lines of 2.2 billion in beef and 1.8 billion in pork. We at one time Japan was a $2 billion pork market for us. So we were looking to push that $4 billion mark. We likely won't get there because of some of the challenges that we had especially in May and June on supply, but we really still expect a very strong second half in Japan. And again, can't emphasize enough that when it comes to delivering value for the U.S. producer and the whole supply chain, Japan really leads the pack in doing that in terms of international markets for U.S. red meat. Next slide, please. Now in China, obviously everybody's familiar with the massive amounts of pork that China is importing due to African swine fever. The volumes of not only pork, but also other proteins entering China this year are really unprecedented. It is important, of course, to keep an eye on China's domestic pork production because it's their ASF-related slump in domestic production that has driven a lot of this demand. And while we are happy to capitalize on this expanded opportunity in China, it is worth noting that the U.S. is by a fairly large margin the least China dependent of all the major pork exporters. We are at this time exporting probably about 35% of our export volume, of our total export volume is going to the China-Hong Kong region. That is quite a lot higher than normal. But when you look at other major pork exporters, Canada is around 45%. European Union about 70%, Brazil and Chile both about 70%. That can be a bit troubling when you consider that China's domestic pork production is definitely going to come back. The Chinese government will move heaven and earth to get their domestic pork production back up. They like to have a very high self-sufficiency rate when it comes to pork. We don't see their domestic pork production getting back to pre-ASF levels until at least 2022. But when that happens, we certainly want to be positioned to keep our overall export growth going. So again, while we are pleased to be able to capitalize on this expanded opportunity for U.S. pork in China, we certainly want to remain diversified and have growth occurring in a variety of markets and not have all of our export growth attributed to China. So that's something that we are very much emphasizing, and we feel pretty good about our position so far in doing that. Cary talked a little bit about the Phase 1 agreement. I would say that on the red meat trade side, the Phase 1 agreement more dramatically impacted beef access. We've been really a niche player in the Chinese market for a long time. Since the market reopened in 2017, we've had small volumes of beef going into China, but the import requirements were so stringent that we really couldn't really see a lot of growth there under those conditions. The Phase 1 agreement significantly increased the percentage of cattle that are now eligible for the Chinese market. Pretty much any animal entering the feedlot would now be eligible for China. They have not yet relaxed their policy on ractopamine, so the feeding program would still need to be targeted for China, but at least we got relief from the zero tolerance on hormones, and we really feel like there's a lot more room for growth under the Phase 1 agreement for beef. Now, Phase 1 also lowered barriers for U.S. pork, and make no mistake about it, with or without Phase 1, we would certainly be moving a lot of pork into China right now. But Phase 1 because Phase 1 lowered obstacles for U.S. pork, created a more transparent environment for the entry of U.S. pork, made more plants eligible for China. Phase 1 is very important for our long-term competitiveness in the Chinese market. So while there was a more dramatic impact for beef, very important agreement also for U.S. pork access to China. And Cary also mentioned the tariff exclusion process. That's separate from Phase 1. It's not part of the Phase 1 agreement, but as importers apply for these tariff exclusions, they can basically get an exclusion for all of the retaliatory duties for U.S. beef, getting down to that 12% most favored nation rate that most suppliers pay. New Zealand beef is duty-free under a trade agreement. Australia, at least until they hit their threshold, they have a lower tariff than that. But those tariff exclusions at least put U.S. beef on a level playing field with most other suppliers. Now, unfortunately, U.S. pork got dinged twice with retaliatory tariffs. The exclusion can take one set of tariffs off, but not the other. So if an importer is successful in getting an exclusion, U.S. pork is subject to about a 33% total tariff. That's a lot higher than the 8% that most suppliers are subject to, but it's a lot better than the 63% we'd be facing without the exclusion. So it is that tariff exclusion process has certainly made U.S. pork more competitive in the Chinese market. We'd really like to see those retaliatory duties go away more permanently, but this at least provides some short-term relief for our products. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about Korea. That has been just a remarkable success story for U.S. beef. It's been about a decade ago. We really were struggling to move product into that market. There's a lot of pushback, BSE-related pushback to moving resuming imports of U.S. beef. You look up 10 or 11 years later, and we're moving almost $2 billion a year into Korea. Outstanding growth in both the retail and the food service sectors. We were really looking at 2020 as being our first $2 billion year for U.S. beef exports to Korea. I don't think we'll get there because of the interruptions in supply, and also Korea is now once again struggling with sort of a second wave of COVID-19, which is a big setback for their restaurant sector. But we still, we're coming off a record year at nearly $1.8 billion in beef exports to Korea. And we're looking for a pretty strong finish to the year, despite some of these challenges. Now, pork exports to Korea were expected to be down this year. Their domestic supplies are up. So that is not really the drop in pork exports to Korea, not really COVID-19 related so much as it is connected to their domestic supplies. Korea actually braced for the ASF impact in China. They could see that China was going to be a big target for a lot of the products, not only U.S. pork, but from Europe and Canada and other markets. A lot of that was going to be funneling into China. So they made efforts to really bolster their domestic production. And while Korea did have, they did experience African swine fever, especially in wild boars, they've done an amazing job of keeping it out of their domestic commercial herd. So they really haven't been impacted. Their supply has not been impacted by African swine fever. In fact, you could argue that it's been bolstered by African swine fever because they were preparing for the situation in China. So we think it'll be probably a year or two before we see great opportunities for growth in pork to Korea. But Korea is a very important pork market for us, especially picnics and butts for further processing. One thing I want to emphasize about Korea is it has been absolutely booming for convenience foods, home meal replacement items, and sales often sold through e-commerce platforms. We have been looking to capitalize on that for a number of years now, emphasizing that convenience factor, finding more U.S. products that can fit into that sector, and also bolstering sales through e-commerce and through delivery platforms. Now, Korea is a little bit different from Japan in that Japanese consumers very easy to reach through social media platforms and other methods like that, but are more reluctant to purchase through e-commerce. They still in Japan consider shopping to be a very personal experience, and so e-commerce sales not so much of a factor. But in Korea, they're very open to that, and we've seen dramatic growth in e-commerce sales, pickup and delivery sales, and we think a lot of that will continue post-COVID. On to the next slide, please. We're looking at a very challenging year in Mexico. I do want to emphasize that Mexico is an extremely important market for U.S. red meat, especially in the pork sector. It is traditionally our largest volume market for U.S. pork, outstanding destination for hams and picnics and other underutilized muscle cuts. And our ability to ship those on a chilled basis to Mexico, for those to come right off the assembly line into a combo bin, be trucked quickly to a processing center in Mexico, that is really important to the profitability of our industry. If Mexico's demand is down and we need to find another destination for those, there are other destinations out there, but it's really a whole different ball game when you have to freeze that product, box it, put it on the water, get it to another destination. That really cuts into the profitability of those items. So important to get our pork demand all the way back in Mexico, which we're certainly working on. We hope to see a strong finish. Pork demand has held up pretty well in Mexico, all things considered, in the first half, but we're looking for a stronger finish to the year. On the beef side, beef demand in Mexico has been hit very hard by the lack of tourism and the slowdown in food service. So getting beef demand back in Mexico is going to be more of a challenge. It's a very important market for us, not only for variety meat, but for underutilized muscle cuts. But certainly we expect the second half to be a bit of a struggle. We'll hope to see that beef business pick up as soon as possible. On one additional note, we did recently gain access to Mexico for U.S. bison meat. The volumes there will likely be small, but it represents another new opportunity for producers that have been in the bison business. Their main export markets have really been Europe and Canada. Mexico opens up a new opportunity for them, especially for some of the underutilized muscle cuts. Next slide, please. I mentioned the U.S. specific share of the duty-free beef quota in Europe. We feel like that's going to really offer us the opportunity to expand and solidify our beef business in Europe. Now we still face the same restrictions on the production side, so it's only a small percentage of U.S. cattle that are eligible for the European market, but we were getting squeezed out of what we really considered our duty-free quota that we won through negotiations resulting from a WTO dispute in which we prevailed, but other suppliers were kind of squeezing us out of that quota. The USTR was successful in getting a U.S. specific share, which would allow us to do business throughout the year, chilled beef business throughout the year in Europe. It was very successful in the first quarter. It was hit hard by the slowdown in the European food service sector in the second quarter, but this is a very important agreement. We feel like it will lay the groundwork for us to have a more consistent success in Europe as we push more and more product, especially in the restaurant sector in Europe. But we also see some gains there, some new opportunities in retail. Next slide, please. I want to briefly touch on Taiwan. Taiwan, for a country of about 24 million people, has just a tremendous appetite for U.S. beef. Last year, record year at $567 million. We will push that this year. We may not get to a record, but we'll be close to that. Much smaller market for U.S. pork, but we do see some opportunities there. They have ractopamine restrictions similar to China, but it is also a good market for us for pork, especially for further processing. Next slide, please. I didn't know quite how to refer to these markets. I decided to call them underappreciated markets. I can't call them emerging because these are markets where we've really been moving substantial volumes of product for several years, but you don't hear as much about them as the mainstay markets that I spoke about earlier. Canada is a market where we don't do a lot of high-profile consumer marketing. We feel like that would be somewhat counterproductive, but we do move substantial amounts of both beef and pork into Canada, both in the retail and restaurant sectors, and especially to the further processing sector. And Canada is our largest market for finished processed beef and pork products. So I can't emphasize enough that Canada is a very important outlet for U.S. red meat products, even though you don't hear about that very often. Market of about 35 million people, but their consumption of U.S. red meat is quite important to us. Oceania, meaning primarily Australia and New Zealand, very important outlet for U.S. pork, especially hams for further processing. We're somewhat restricted. Most of our product that goes into Australia and New Zealand has to go straight to approved processing centers for further processing. We're moving a lot of product there. Australia, especially one of our largest destinations for hams. And interesting that while Australia has such a reputation for beef consumption, pork consumption has actually overtaken per capita beef consumption in Australia. And then South America, we primarily serve Colombia, Chile, and Peru, but we've seen some expanded opportunities for exports to South America as we've gained access to new markets like Argentina, Uruguay, and most recently Bolivia. Next slide, please. In some of our emerging destinations, I mentioned that we have a representative of Sub-Saharan Africa. We see that as a long-term source of growth. Southeast Asia is a region where we've, especially in Indonesia, is a very populous country where we feel like we've never really had consistent access for beef, but through through some WTO victories and some other removal of some other obstacles, we see great opportunities there. And also Eastern Europe, as we go east of the European Union, we do see opportunities for growth in that region as well. So these are some markets that are maybe in that next frontier category as we look to expand exports further. Next, please. Just want to touch briefly as we conclude here on how we're doing on U.S. lamb. Obviously, our lamb sector is much smaller than beef or pork, but it is an important part of our portfolio. Last year, we had a good solid year, second largest volume, largest value since 2014. 2020 has been more of a challenge. In markets like the Caribbean, lamb is very dependent on a thriving food service and hospitality sector. And of course, with lack of tourism, key markets like the Caribbean and also Mexico and Costa Rica, it's been more difficult to move lamb there. Mexico is our main volume market. We have a lot of underutilized cuts and variety meat to Mexico. So it is a very, very important destination for U.S. lamb, and it's held up pretty well in 2020 as it's not as dependent on the tourism sector. For some high value markets where we've recently gained access, that would be Japan and Taiwan. We think these are very promising markets. The volumes moved there to date have been rather small, but we do see some opportunities for growth there, especially in the high-end dining sector. So that concludes my slides for today. I'll look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Joe. We appreciate your insight in the red meat market, and certainly appreciate I think it's important that we realize the importance of our world markets and how that impacts our consumer demands in our domestic market as well. So up next, I'd like to invite Florentino Lopez to our conversation. He's going to walk us through and moderate some discussion amongst us now at the remainder portion of the day. But a little bit about Florentino is that he is the executive director of the United Sorghum Checkoff program, which is a farmer-led organization dedicated to improving the sorghum industry through research, promotion, and education. Before joining the Sorghum Checkoff, Florentino served as the production manager of Texas Farm LLC in Perryton, Texas, where he was involved with the export of Texas farm pork into the European Union and Japanese marketplace. Florentino, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Definitely, I want to get right into the questions. I know a lot of you have probably been wondering all of the things that are going on. Of course, there's no question that as we look to the changing times, there definitely is a bigger need to make sure we are able to get product throughout the world. Definitely, as Secretary Beam said earlier, that ability to ship to 97 countries and have a relationship with those individuals is paramount. Our ability to continue to create opportunity for our farmers, of course, is what we're trying to do on a daily basis. And I know Joe and Cary definitely in your organizations, as well as Kansas Department of Ag, are highly centered in that. You know, today, as we look at a grain market, a corn market that basically is struggling to get to $4, pork that's struggling to get to a $60 market, and cattle, well, they're doing a little bit better at the 110 mark. We definitely know that these export markets are important. One of the things that I guess I'd like to ask right out, I don't see any questions, but with that, I'd like to ask, you know, Cary, Joe, you talked a lot about information. You shared a lot of information that many producers, many ranchers, many others might not really know about. where can they find that information? Where can they get kind of a snapshot on a weekly basis? Is there a place that they're able to get information from the two organizations and or other organizations that really share what's going on in the industry? Cary?
Yeah, sure. The U.S. Grain Council, we put out what we call our global updates every week, every Thursday afternoon, which gives kind of an overview of what's going on for us, program and market-wise around the world. And if you want to receive that directly, you can go to the U.S. Grain Council's website and sign up for that, or send me a note. I'll definitely make sure, or contact the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and they'll get you in touch with us. We can get you on that distribution list. And I know, and we provide a lot of information out to the various different state and national checkoffs that they use in their own weekly updates. And so whether it's Kansas Corn or such that's putting out weekly newsletters and such, some of the export data that they put in that usually comes from us as well. If you're interested in prices, we do have both a weekly market perspectives that looks at corn, sorghum, DDGS prices globally, along with transportation, and we even have a ethanol price report. Those are both available on our website at grains.org, and you can sign up to receive those. If you're looking for more detailed information, I mean, it's maybe specific to what you may want. You may need to contact me or others directly to, like those corn prices that I put up there on China. That's not necessarily out there on the public. That's actually something I've put together going back numerous years. And some of our other staff have used, and even our China office keeps it up as well. And so, something like that. If somebody wants the information, they'll let us know. We can work with you. But that's and then obviously USDA puts out all kinds of, on their gain reports, puts out all kinds of information. When it pertains to grain products, a lot of times are even asking us for input into what goes into those various gain reports that USDA puts out. Almost every day you can see those reports coming out.
Excellent, Cary. Definitely grains.org. Joe, anything to add there? A particular website that they could reach?
Right. We have similar vehicles. Our main website, usmef.org. We were always updating our activities there. We also put out a monthly summary of where things stand on the beef, pork, and lamb export side. How did we fare this most recent month, and where are we year to date? We post that monthly. Then we have a biweekly newsletter that a lot of producers maybe get through their Beef Council or their corn or soybean organization, but if they'd like to obtain it directly and contact me, we can add them to our distribution list. That's a every other week type of newsletter that we put out. And then we also are asked to do a lot of guest articles or pieces for our state organizations. And so we work often with the Kansas Corn and Soybean Commission, Kansas Beef Council. We put out a lot of information through them to producers that way. So those are some examples of where people can get information from USMEF.
Thanks, Joe. Of course, as Secretary Beam said earlier, exports are critical out there. We continue to see that the export market is definitely something that we need to keep an eye on. So from all of your perspectives, kind of looking at it from a farmer, a producer, an individual serving out there, what can he do? What can that farmer do? What can that producer do that helps encourage international markets? Is there something that he should be doing to try to shape trade? Is there any items in particular that you would point them toward? I'll first go out to Joe on that.
I think that producers can always help when they have the opportunity to communicate with their policymakers, with the people that are determining trade policy. Giving a unified pro-trade voice is always helpful. And the message that that we think is most effective is that our producers want the opportunity to compete. You know, you might see a lot of press around particular countries, trading partners, promising to buy this much, committing to buy this much. That's great. You know, we'd like to see that, but really these are business to business transactions. So those commitments, those obligations, those targets are, that's all well and good, but what we really need is just a smooth business environment with as few barriers as possible so that U.S. suppliers can connect with their consumers in international markets. The government to government agreements are great, but beyond that, beyond what they put on paper, there has to be a smooth trade environment, a good business climate. And so that's what I really emphasize to producers is anytime they get the opportunity to express to policymakers that what we really want is the opportunity to compete internationally and market our product internationally on a level playing field with as few obstacles as possible, we think that's helpful.
Secretary Beam, anything you would add on that?
Well, I would say that the two organizations that are represented here deserve a lot, continued support. I'm amazed at the wealth of knowledge and years of experience in their staff. So I would urge folks to continue to support that. Secondly, I think it's important to follow it and be engaged because, as Joe said, talking to congressional members, it helps to be informed, but to have those engagements and discussions. So I think it's incumbent, if you're in the marketplace and the degree of, or the role that international markets play in that, I think it's important to follow it. And these organizations is one way to do that.
Definitely. Any other items that you would add, Cary?
I would just add, be active in either the national or state associations that are involved in lobbying, whether it's the National Corn Growers Association, National Sorghum Producers, or at the state level. The U.S. Grain Council, we're not allowed to lobby. We can educate on what you should be lobbying for, but we can't actually go and do it. And so to be active, one, to be educated on what those issues are, and to be able to, make that push at the congressional level in a bigger fashion than individually. I think it's quite important for people to be active at both the national and state levels to make your voices heard.
I believe we're coming into time now. Closing comments or?
Well, I would just say we can probably take one, maybe one more question. And my computer has died, so I cannot see the Q&A that's down at the bottom. I don't know if Florentino, you've been able to take a look at that or not. We might, let's work through these questions quickly and see if there's something that we can, if anybody had, and then we can wrap up.
Excellent, thank you. I'm not seeing any
Oh, okay. Well, they've pulled up here on my end. So, or thanks to our great IT. And the first one is, how do STEP grants, state delegations, etc., support the international effort, and also the value of the farmer trade participation? I'll just open that up to whoever wants to answer that one.
Cary, I know that, of course, there's several different states that are involved on those. You might touch on that? Or?
Thanks, Jesse, for that question. Yeah, I know, and the sorghum side of things have been quite active on that. It's been great for us. This last 6 months, basically no international travel, but we hope to get back to that. But being able to use those STEP grants and have some farmers and producers to take part, whether that's traveling to China and meeting face to face with some of the big sorghum buyers and importers and end users there, or going to a brand new market where we're trying to break in. So using those STEP grants that some of the state associations have been able to get to allow some funding for producer travel, we've been able to work that in and build it into our other programming and make it a well-rounded program by having even the producers themselves involved in it.
All right, thank you very much. The next question I think we'll direct towards Joe. Could you expand on the topic of consumers finding that meal box delivery and ordering online for pickup at the store are services that'll stick around after COVID? And just how much do you think that will affect our meat sales at a time when restaurants and food services are being pinched and impacted?
I would say yes, it will absolutely survive after COVID. I think that there's an uptick in that business that will never go away. I think it will vary by market. I talked about a little bit of the contrast we see in markets like Korea and Taiwan, where consumers are much more open to making actual purchases online, whereas in Japan, it's really more of they'll go online to educate themselves about products and recipes and things like that, but still very much on the in-person buying. Latin America, I think, had to come, they need to come a lot farther as far as the e-commerce standpoint, ordering and purchasing online compared to the Asian markets. So it will vary by market, but I do think you will see it survive well beyond COVID. We'll see an uptick in that business that will go on for many years to come. And sometime in some markets, I think you think about how often people used to, for example, go to the bank as opposed to going to the bank today. So in certain places, does going to the grocery store become more like going to the bank? It's something that a lot of people used to do, but now they only do on occasion, whereas they take care of most of those transactions without ever walking in the door. I don't think it'll go to that extreme, but I think in some markets you'll see a long-standing uptick in that business.
I actually had that thought myself yesterday as I was picking groceries up and wondered if this was the new norm, if I just would pull up and to a distribution center that loaded my car basically for me. So the last question is also is asked towards Joe, and can you just touch on briefly on the hide values, as most of those are exported, and we've seen some challenges certainly in that area, and certainly a part of that whole animal that is being marketed. So do you have any comments on the hide?
Well, I appreciate the question. USMEF actually only represents edible products. So when we talk about offal, beef offal, pork offal, we're strictly talking about offal for human consumption. Any of the industrial use, that is not really within our charge. Now, I do understand what Matt is talking about with that question. The hide value, you look at it, it's kind of depressing. I go back a decade or so when we really saw strong demand for hides. The automotive sector especially seemed to be a real growing customer for hides. And so certainly that's an area we'd like to see more value. North American Meat Institute actually has a division that is focused on export of hides, actually utilization of hides, both in the domestic and foreign markets. So there's, might want to contact North American Meat Institute for more information on that. As I said, it's kind of outside of our purview.
Well, thanks though for those comments nonetheless. We've had the chance to work with the Meat Institute a little bit this year throughout everything. So I think that's something that we can bring up with them next time we talk with them. So thank you. I just wanted to note that today that our applications went live for the grants as part of the CARES Act funding, including our Securing Local Foods Systems grant, which was designed to support our meat processing facilities, food processors, food banks, and our local direct to consumer producers, as well as grocery outlets, and as we try to increase our capacity within the state of Kansas. You can find those applications and eligibility requirements for those of you that might be interested online at kansascommerce.gov/COVID relief.
Thank you, Kelsey. And thank you for joining us today. This is the last of the 3 crossover sections that we've had. And of course, the 20th of the webinars that we've had. Tomorrow, will be the finale, the actual growth summit. We're pleased that Governor Laura Kelly will be able to join us for this keynote session. In addition, we're honored that Ken Isley, the administrator of the USDA Foreign Agricultural Service, will be with us to share information about issues impacting the U.S. ag sector. I'm sure international trade will be a part of that. And in addition, we'll highlight the findings, observations, and recommendations that came through in the 17 breakout sector sessions. And then we'll also honor several outstanding Kansans who have made a significant contribution to their communities this year. Kelsey, there's been a lot of those, and it's been difficult to narrow those down, but we're going to at least honor some of those that have been submitted to us by all of you in attendance. So that's it for today. I thank you again to Cary Sifferath, Joe Schuele, and Florentino Lopez for leading the discussions about international trade. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you all.